Welcome back to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. We have our second panel on the issues of federal responses to hurricanes and Harvey, civil and protections following a natural disaster. We introduce the panelists in the order in which our first panelist is Romero Kraft, Director of the Southeast Region for Latino Justice, PERLDEF, Latino Justice. Our second panelist is Andrés Gallegos, Chairman, National Council on Disability. Our third panelist is Nicole Roy, Project Coordinator, Salvation Army. Panelist is Charley Willison, Postdoctoral Fellow. Dr. Willison is with the Harvard Medical School. So Ms. Romero Kraft, please proceed. We've got a timer, no, not set up in the corner. I will time you for 7 minutes, and on that countdown, you'll see me waving hands when you're close to the end. So Ms. Romero Kraft, you're the first one. Please proceed.
Thank you very much. Thank you all, Chair Cantu and members of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. My name is Romero Kraft, and I serve as the Director of the Southeast Region for Latino Justice, PERLDEF, the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund. Latino Justice is a human and civil rights organization dedicated to defending the rights of all Latinos, including Puerto Ricans, and is anchored in the experience of the Puerto Rico diaspora since our inception. Today, we continue to address the civil and constitutional rights of Puerto Rican and Latino communities. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you in the place of Juan Cartagena about the ongoing issues related to Hurricane Maria, including the effect on migration and the difficulties evacuees faced, the disparities and inequalities associated with relief, and the continuing rebuilding efforts and the struggles that persist still today, almost 4 years later. I have been working with impacted Puerto Rican evacuees since 2017 and have experienced firsthand the complaints of discrimination suffered by Puerto Ricans fleeing disaster, but also have witnessed the lasting trauma associated with such a disaster. Over 175,000 people fled Puerto Rico within 1 year of Hurricane Maria, and instead of being welcomed with sympathy and safety, they were met with additional hardships, lack of stability, and abject disregard for the long-term rebuilding efforts required to provide equity to Puerto Ricans living on the island. Under the Stafford Act, Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands are covered with the same protections and force as applicable to the states, as the act prohibits discrimination in the provision of disaster assistance to jurisdictions like the colony of Puerto Rico. And yet it is clear from multiple government reports, news articles, and studies conducted that Puerto Rico received disparate treatment and to their detriment. The Government Accountability Office has found that FEMA's response to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico alone represents the largest and longest single response in the agency's history. FEMA itself reported in its after action report of 2018 that the pre-hurricane planning assumptions were severely underestimated when looking at actual damage and required significantly more assistance than expected. Not only did FEMA not adequately predict or prepare for a storm such as one like Hurricane Maria in response, FEMA lacked the necessary personnel needed to handle the storms. And even when FEMA sent staff, not as many staff deployed at one time, and the staff that was disparate treatment with lack of funding. While states affected by Hurricanes Harvey and Irma awarded nearly $1 billion in aid to survivors within 2 months post-landfall, survivors of Hurricane Maria on the island did not get awarded the same amount of funding until nearly 4 months after landfall. Despite the blatant failures by FEMA, it must be understood that Puerto Rico's financial crisis created a different and more complex situation that FEMA was prepared for. The response to Maria required a reimbursement program, with local agencies providing the initial funding for the work and seeking reimbursements afterwards. Yet these municipalities and the island overall is crippled by debt that restricted this program, which made the program ineffective in the face of the scale of devastation caused by the hurricane to the island's infrastructure. As such, of the $23.8 billion allocated, Puerto Rico has only spent $158 million for long-term rebuilding projects. While our written testimony did not include assertions of discrimination claims made outside of our lawsuit Asensio v. FEMA, the case that we filed, we'd like to amend this statement and assert that housing discrimination and wrongful ejection did occur. On February 2019, news reports noted that of the 1.1 million claims made by Puerto Ricans living on the island for assistance from FEMA, less than half were approved because FEMA either denied requests for repair outright or demanded onerous and expensive alternative documentation. And in Florida, we dealt with survivors who were wrongfully ejected from hotels receiving TSA funding, as well as those seeking lease or rental opportunities being charged application fees for units that were non-existent. For individuals fleeing disaster without resources, the impact of lack of affordable housing and housing instability cannot be understated. In closing, we emphasize that the aftermath and the response to two different disasters in two different jurisdictions varied immensely. However, the Stafford Act, along with its non-discrimination mandates, does not make such a distinction. We submit that the White House made those distinctions repeatedly. It is impossible to ignore that there is still work to be done in Puerto Rico. By plane, you can see blue tarps that serve as roofs for those individuals who have yet to recover. These blue tarps also serve as stark reminders of the work that needs to be done. Darkness covered the entire island when Hurricanes Irma and Maria hit in September 2017, with only the stars to light the night. Citizens awaited for answers about when power would return. Some of our fellow citizens waited in the dark for an entire year in the longest blackout in American history. And almost 4 years later, they still remain in the dark, metaphorically and often literally, with a crippled infrastructure and the fear of an impending storm with stronger force looming in the distance. We must bring Puerto Rico out of the years of darkness and provide the support that is due to Puerto Ricans. Thank you very much for your time and attention and the opportunity to speak on behalf of impacted Puerto Rican evacuees and to fight for equality today.
Thank you, Ms. Romero Kraft. Mr. Gallegos, we'll hear from you now. Please proceed.
Chair Cantu, commissioners, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this briefing. I refer you to my written testimony, which provides background to the issues that I will highlight here. The federal and local response, both in Puerto Rico and Houston, failed people with disabilities with deadly consequences. People with disabilities were not included in emergency planning and were excluded from accessing much of the disaster relief provided in their aftermath. In addition, there was a notable disparate federal response to Hurricane Maria as compared to the federal response to Hurricane Harvey. Since the post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act of 2006 required the National Council on Disability and FEMA to work close with each other to improve the outcomes of persons with disabilities before, during, and after major disasters, NCD has served as a liaison with the disability community and FEMA. My comments here are informed by meetings and discussions with the disabilities community. In fact, in May 2018, the National Council on Disability went to Houston to hear firsthand from the disability community. And we went to Puerto Rico in May 2019 to do the same. While today's briefing focuses on discrete aspects of FEMA's response to these natural disasters, as it pertains to Puerto Rico, I think it's important that we understand the plight of people with disabilities residing on the island before September 2017. Now, that's important to better understand why they were so vulnerable to the effects of the hurricane and why greater efforts to address their needs and recovery was required. Look, we're talking about the needs of approximately 687,000 people, representing 21.7% of the island's population. People with disabilities were vulnerable to the effects of the hurricane, which was very predictable given the shaky infrastructure supporting their needs prior to the hurricane. Please note that their vulnerability was not predictable because of the existence of their disabilities, rather because of the environmental, societal, and political infrastructure of the island. There was significant economic vulnerability given the island's economic condition and its disparate treatment in federal benefit programs. The island's economic posture was bleak. It filed for the equivalent of federal bankruptcy protection in May 2017. More than 45% of the island's population lived below the federal poverty level. That's more than 3 times the US national poverty rate. In 2017, the poverty rate was 48% among working age people with disabilities. Residents in Puerto Rico are ineligible for the Supplemental Security Income SSI program, arguably the single most important safety net program for people with disabilities in the United States. Instead, they receive benefits under its predecessor program, the Aid to the Aged, Blind, and Disabled program, AABD. AABD, however, is not a substitute for SSI. It provides significantly lower benefits. Today, the maximum monthly SSI benefit is $741 compared to $75 under AAVD. Moreover, there was significant food insecurity. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, is available in all 50 states, DC, Guam, and the Virgin Islands, but not in Puerto Rico. Instead, Puerto Rico receives a block grant to fund its own nutritional assistance program, NAP. SNAP benefits are larger than NAP benefits. The criteria to qualify for SNAP are lower than that of NAP. The healthcare system also faced challenges, mainly because it was underfunded. Unlike the 50 states in DC, Medicaid spending in Puerto Rico has been subject to a statutory annual cap. The scope of the island's Medicaid program itself was severely limited. It does not cover home health services, hospice services, medical equipment and supplies, or nursing facility services. All of the foregoing contributed to a low degree of resiliency in the ability of Puerto Rican residents with disabilities to respond to the effects of the hurricane. Thus, when Puerto Rico was hit by Hurricane Maria, the effects were magnified for its residents with disabilities. As reported by the Puerto Rico Disability Community Relief Network, there was only one fully accessible centralized shelter for people with disabilities. Schools used for shelters in the 78 municipalities were physically accessible. They had a ramp for wheelchair access, but did not have accessible sleeping areas, accessible showers, medical assistance, medical supplies, alternate power, or sign language interpreters. None were equipped to address the needs of persons with intellectual or developmental disabilities. As reported by the Partnership for Inclusive Disaster Strategies in its May 2018 After Action report, people with disabilities were turned away from both general and special needs shelters. Among the reasons included power dependence, the need for personal assistance services, service animals, mental health conditions, and a need for support due to cognitive or intellectual disabilities. And disaster survivors with disabilities also did not have equal access to the FEMA application process. In closing, by failing to ensure access to the disaster relief services, FEMA violated the rights guaranteed to individuals with disabilities under the federal non-discrimination laws. That was clearly noted on October 25, 2017, when the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Homeland Security wrote to the Homeland Security's acting secretary and FEMA's acting administrator, requesting answers as to why the civil rights of people with disabilities were not protected during the response to Hurricane Maria. The letter accused both of playing hot potato with their responsibilities to protect the civil rights of disaster survivors, pointing out that people with disabilities were paying the price. The exact price is unknown. According to the 2018 George Washington University study, Hurricane Maria resulted in the death of 2,975 people. How many were people with disabilities is not exactly known. Disability is not a mortality data point captured in the United States or in Puerto Rico. Thank you again for the opportunity to brief the commission.
Thank you, Chair Gallegos. Our third panelist, Nicole Roy, would you please proceed?
Good afternoon today to everybody, and thank you for the honor of being invited to this panel. I have the great honor of serving as the project coordinator for the Salvation Army long-term recovery here in Puerto Rico. I came as a volunteer and was supposed to stay 2 weeks, and I never left. The injustice that I saw here and also the need was profound. I had volunteered in many other disasters across primarily the US, and had seen a much more interactive role, a much more cohesive role with municipalities and across the local entities. Some of that was missing. Logistically, things were delayed here as well. When we first started to become an organization that was looking at doing a long-term recovery effort here in Puerto Rico, we had set boundaries and had already had a set denomination of funds. We had to escalate that, seeing the need and trying to reach the need. We have now at this point done direct services of over 30 million. That is in product, that is direct service to a person that is tangible. We have had over 31,400 clients. Those are not individuals, that's a family entity. So the need was profound. The gap areas that we were seeing on the boots, feet on the boots, on the ground here, were a concern for us. We saw many people denied for generators that had medical needs, disabilities, that needed extenuating assistance or in-person visits. They could not reach the DRCs at the time, eventually turned into CRCs. They could not access anything online, and that was a large-scale confusion here on the island. You had people that were not able to read or write, so some of the process was difficult for them. We had to walk them through things and do even reapplications after they were denied. The cultural insensitivity here also was prevalent in the fact that when homes were being assessed, unfortunately, they were not being understood as this is a family home, an entity that has been passed down. There was a lot of cultural confusion with how to proceed, as this is not the United States, this is Puerto Rico. And unfortunately, many people got left behind in that, and we had to really help. We were lucky for free legal assistance that partnered with us. We were lucky for those that were willing to come out and do assessments. And again, this was something that there was a disconnect with an outside force and with FEMA, with that actual survivor. I want to talk about what actually happened with the one true survivor that needed the help then and there. The blackout was something that needed to be addressed as far as those with disabilities and severe needs. The mental health, we had the highest amount of suicide ideation in this time frame, things that were not being addressed. All DRCs and CRCs were in downtown areas of the 78 municipalities, and unfortunately that was not something that was accessible to most people. That was a large logistical concern. The two smaller islands off of Puerto Rico, Culebra and Vieques, were delayed significantly in services and were not able to be treated on equal services as the main island of Puerto Rico. Vieques still is very much behind in what they are able to provide their people in forms of recovery methods, where mainland Puerto Rico recovered significantly faster. You have rural areas, specifically pocketed rural areas that were more than a year delayed, as well as Vieques, which is a population of almost 10,000 people that are survivors as well. I talk about the human nature of the delays and the logistical issues that I see and the lack of cohesion with the local entities of the 78 municipalities and the local NGOs. I feel like this has improved in some capacity. I can talk because I live here on island and lived through the earthquakes. There was improvements. There was measures trying to be met with both logistics, legal, language, cultural modifications. And that was something that aided in the efforts being faster. I still am very grateful that you are all looking into this now and that you are willing to hear what everybody has to say. This is how we learn and improve. And I'm very thankful and honored to be asked to be on this. And I also indicate everything on the written statement as well. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. We would like to hear from you now. Please proceed.
Thank you, commissioners, for inviting me to participate. Oh.
Dr. Willison.
No problem. Thank you so much. Thank you, commissioners, for inviting me to participate in today's discussion. My focus is on the federal responses to Hurricanes Maria and Harvey and considerations for improving equity in future federal disaster responses. I will also include Hurricane Irma in Florida in my comments as a relevant comparison point. The outcomes and choices governments make in disaster responses are increasingly important as we face the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and anthropogenic climate change that increases the likelihood of public health disasters. Racial or ethnic minority group members and low-income individuals are the most at risk of adverse health and economic consequences during disasters. Recognizing these risks and addressing accessibility barriers during federal aid deliberations will help the federal government prepare for future disasters and reduce the risk of exacerbating inequities in future disaster responses. In 2017, the federal government responded on a larger scale and much more quickly across measures of federal money and staffing to Hurricanes Harvey and Irma in Texas and Florida, compared with Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. The Trump administration often argued that the delay of money and goods to Puerto Rico was based on geographic limitations. Yet, disaster appropriation funding to Puerto Rico took over 4 months after landfall to reach a comparable amount of money received by Florida and Texas in half the amount of time. The additional 2 months to distribute critical aid is likely not explained by geography, but likely a product of congressional negotiations seeking to demonstrate that Puerto Rico had no sufficient assets to deploy and required financial assistance. Similarly, federal staffing rates in Puerto Rico reached comparable levels in 3 times the amount of time as Texas and 30 times the amount of time as Irma in Florida. The magnitude of this variation seems difficult to explain by geography. The variation in the responses was not commensurate with storm severity and need after landfall in the case of Puerto Rico compared with Texas and Florida. Hurricanes Harvey and Irma made landfall as Category 4 hurricanes, and Maria hit Puerto Rico as a high-end Category 4. Maria caused more damage in Puerto Rico than Irma in Florida or Harvey in Texas. When considering the mortality rates as a measure of need or severity from the disasters, the mortality rates resulting from Hurricane Maria were more than 30 times greater than that of Harvey or Irma. If disaster responses vary in their effectiveness across communities, health equity is affected. Representation in debates over disaster aid influence accessibility of requests for aid. Research conducted by my colleagues and I in 2021 analyzes federal congressional aid deliberations as measured in congressional floor debates over funding and disaster aid relief for the 2017 hurricanes for 6 months after landfall. We find bipartisan participation in floor debates over aid to both Texas and Florida, however, mostly Democrat participation for Puerto Rico. Overall, deliberation and participation in debate was strongly related to whether or not a state or district was at risk of natural disasters itself. Nearly 30% of all states in the United States did not participate in any aid debate regarding supplemental appropriations for the 2017 hurricanes during the time period. Our results suggest that the deaths of thousands of Americans may not be enough to mobilize congressional participation in disaster aid deliberations, and that legislators may be more incentivized to participate in debates if they perceive disaster risks to their districts. This may exacerbate disparities where some states have more advocacy for disaster aid in considering the Disaster Relief Fund and supplemental appropriations compared to other states. These disparities are exacerbated by existing political structures. Puerto Ricans are American citizens, but Puerto Rico lacks congressional representation. Puerto Rico is one of 5 US territories. The territories are granted congressional delegates, 1 per each territory, and only in the House, with no voting power on the floor of Congress. Previous scholarship demonstrates the delegate presence on the floor, as opposed to voting membership, obscures territorial interests in broader congressional deliberations. Puerto Rico has been a US colony without independent political status or integrated representation and political power in the United States since 1898. As a result of these institutional constraints and colonial status, Puerto Rico faces accessibility barriers to federal aid debates. According to Puerto Rico, greater voting power would likely reduce future barriers of requests for disaster aid. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. At this point, we'll accept questions from the commissioners. If I can offer an apology that I cut off the two of the commissioners and the first, offer to them an opportunity to be first in this panel. Dr. Gilchrist.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a brief question to Dr. Willison. So thank you all for your testimony. Are you familiar with the Oversight and Management Board of Puerto Rico?
I am, although this is not my area of expertise, so I may defer to some other panelists on this.
Okay, well, I'll certainly yield to the other panelists as well. I was just curious to know if any of the panelists felt like this particular board had any involvement as it relates to the assistance that was necessary to get to the residents of Puerto Rico, if in fact this board had any impact on that, positively or negatively.
I can say, based on some of my previous research, that the board and the constraints placed on Puerto Rico in terms of the aid that it was able to receive based on the rules of the board did affect aid considerations. For example, and again, I'm sure that other panelists can speak to this as well. There were 3 supplemental appropriations in Congress in the first 6 months after landfall of the hurricanes. And while Harvey and Irma received supplemental appropriations without conditions, Puerto Rico did receive far more conditions, for example, in the form of loans as opposed to relief as a result of these constraints through PROMESA and its territorial status. Something else to consider is that the island had, prior to the hurricane, over $70 billion in debt, but does not receive the same bankruptcy protections as states. And so this was something else where Puerto Rico, which surprisingly enough actually had to demonstrate need for aid, even though it already faced much more compromised infrastructure and economic standing prior to the hurricanes compared to US states.
Thank you very much for your comments. Any other panelists weigh in on that? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Kirsanow.
Thank you, Madam Chair. No questions.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate you. Would anyone else? I see Commissioner Adams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for Dr. Willison. Are you aware of the number in your study that was allocated to Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, the amount of money, federal money?
Yes, I do have those numbers, and this is also in my written testimony as well. And I can pull up specific numbers if you're
interested. Does the number 27 billion sound about right?
I don't have that in front of me. Could you give me more specifics about what
I'll represent my understanding is that it's $27 billion. Do you think that amount was inadequate?
So this is something that I can't speak to myself in terms of the amount, but what I can address is the disparities in the amount of aid that was received between different jurisdictions and at different time points. And
well, if you're commenting on disparities, I'm curious as to what would have been the better amount.
So while I'm not a risk assessor, but what I can say, and my written testimony demonstrates this, when we're talking about disparities, we would assume that since Puerto Rico had faced the same amount of storm damage as Harvey and Irma, and faced incomparable mortality rates, that Puerto Rico would have, during the time frame, received similar amounts of federal spending, and it did not. While it has received more aid over the years, if we look at the initial 6 months after landfall, congressional aid was delayed, and I can pull up these time points if you'd like, and it also did not receive as much aid as quickly.
Right, but you don't have an answer as for what would have been adequate.
What would have been adequate would be to have Puerto Rico receive the same amount of federal aid as Harvey and Irma, at the same time point.
Okay.
And possibly more, again, because of the limited infrastructure in Puerto Rico and the severe mortality that we know came out of the hurricane.
Okay, I'm confused because Harvey, they received $2 billion versus 27. Are you basing your assessment that they didn't receive enough on per capita reasons?
So again, I apologize, I don't have these numbers directly in front of me, but from my study and in my written testimony, when we were looking at the initial congressional allocation, so this is in 2017, and when we're looking at the FEMA aid that was distributed to families and individuals, Puerto Rico did not receive as much aid as Harvey and Irma at the same time points, and it was delayed by periods of months.
Right. Last question for you. You talked about status as a territory under the Constitution. Of course, territories are not states. And there have been a number of status plebiscites in Puerto Rico over the years. Do you think the amount of aid that would have come to after Harvey, that Puerto Rico would have been better off under independence or under something like free association or under the status quo?
That is a very good question. What I can speak to is concerns with statehood and how this works in Congress. So we know that Congress plays a really big role in regards to disaster aid because of the Disaster Relief Fund. Congress assesses annual appropriations to the Disaster Relief Fund, as well as makes quick supplemental appropriations when it's needed during major disaster events. And this is where representation really comes into play, right? And this can be both as an accountability mechanism if disaster aid is not allocated as quickly as needed, or it can also just be an initial request. And so when we're looking at congressional members and when they spoke on behalf of need to different communities, Maria, discussions of aid to Maria and advocacy for aid for Maria was substantially lower than congressional advocating for aid to Harvey and Irma in Florida. And so granting representation and specifically voting status to Puerto Rico would likely make a big difference in these debate considerations.
And I'm sorry, I'm not sure you understood my question, and that may be my fault. Had Puerto Rico chosen independence decades ago, would they have been better off or worse off or the same after Harvey?
That is a great question, and I don't think I can speak to that. I think that would be a tough assessment to make, but it's definitely a very important consideration and an ongoing debate in Puerto Rico. And there are camps in both sides about whether independence or statehood is important for the island. And that is something that I can't comment on, but perhaps some of the other panelists can.
Commissioner, you're asking a legal question of a medical doctor. So if you would rephrase it to where her expertise would be of use to you, I'd suggest that.
And to
I
clarify,
don't have anything else. Thanks a lot.
I'm not a medical doctor. I'm a social scientist, but yes, I do not have expertise in this area specifically, and I don't want to speak out of my area of expertise. So thank you so much.
I apologize. I promoted you. Commissioner Kladney has his hand up, and let me ask Commissioner Kirsanow questions.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate you very much. Again, Commissioner Kladney, I know you've got questions.
I've always got questions. Everybody gets tired of me asking questions. Chairman Gallegos, are you familiar with 1812F waivers?
I am not.
Okay. Is there a tracking system for individuals who are separated from their friends and family? Disabled people are sent to places like hospitals, and we talked about that on the earlier panel. Is there a tracking system that FEMA uses or local communities use?
You're saying in Puerto Rico or in general?
In general, well, either in Puerto Rico or in Houston during the hurricane.
With respect to Puerto Rico, it's my understanding there is no tracking system. And that was part of the problem because The island's government didn't even know where people with disabilities resided. There wasn't a single source of data where they could go to identify where these people were, where they were concentrated, or how to get them to a single centralized accessible shelter. So the absence of accounting for people with disability on the island attributed greatly to the disparities that they faced during the hurricane.
And I was wondering if you could comment on Ms. Johnson's response to my question regarding Olmsted and its relationship and application to local entities in disaster relief.
So I apologize, I didn't hear her response, if that was in the prior session.
Ms. Roy, could you describe the issues surrounding access for disabled folks in Puerto Rico? I understand they only had one facility that was able to take disabled people, and then there were many more that had to be flown to stateside for care because of inability to provide all sorts of different access and applications and services in Puerto Rico. Could you expand on that?
Yes, hi. Good afternoon. Many of the hospitals were incapacitated, so they could not even perform regular duties during this time. If they were not able to come to the metropolitan area, which logistically was very difficult, some areas like in Morovis and Orocovis in the centralized area of Puerto Rico were blocked off by mudslides, rock slide formations, and the rivers over flooding. And same with Utuado. So many people couldn't be reached. They couldn't even be identified by GPS coordinates. It was very difficult. They had points coming in by helicopter. When it was able to be an extraction, they were brought again to, like I said, either to the metropolitan area or to Florida. The difficulties and the delays in that process were difficult. And if I can speak to what the previous chairman had said, the municipalities had not previously identified those that would be in need in a time of a disaster. And that caused many delays, additional ramifications of death and additional illnesses, but also the scrambling of NGOs here on the ground to try to coordinate with local first responders to try to get to those people without having logistical coordinations. So the delay time was difficult, and yes, they did send them out of the Puerto Rico area.
At the time the hurricane made landfall, had FEMA or anyone else, local entities or anything like that, preset supplies in anticipation of a disaster?
There was some, and it was mostly concentrated in the metropolitan area, but there were some sent to be prepared. Unfortunately, those items were not sent to the smaller islands off of Puerto Rico and to rural areas that then were isolated.
Were they adequate?
No.
Did they use open captioning in Puerto Rico during the hurricane? The open captioning on the TV where you can't shut it off and the scroll goes along the bottom.
I don't remember. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I apologize.
I have nothing at this time further, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Yaki?
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. First, I want to make a brief point. One agency we didn't hear from was the Small Business Administration, which has a substantial presence in terms of economic injury disaster loans to homeowners and to small businesses. And I think we need to make sure that we send these interrogatories to them as well. Secondly, to the point that was being made earlier, we can debate what the status of Puerto Rico could be in the future, or had it been changed somewhere. But these are American citizens. And the fact is that when you look at the relief aid to Hawaii in 1992 after Hurricane Iniki, you did not see these congressional hearings going on because the federal response to Hawaii, which is represented by 2 United States senators and 2 members of Congress, was like that. Secondly, on that score, the amount of American mobilization of the military to aid Haiti after their horrific quake compared to Puerto Rico was better. So we can get into that as well, but not at this time. I do want to ask though a question of Ms. Romero Craft, and that is, this is a question I asked earlier to the folks at FEMA, and that is, to what extent, do they, or did they, or have they, or will they look at, for example, the population that is about to be hit by a hurricane, and prepare accordingly in terms of language, in terms of cultural and linguistic competency? And is that something that you think that FEMA should be involved in for the future in terms of how they deal with disaster response? I mean, obviously there are going to be some that happen and they can't deal with it because they happen, but hurricanes that you can track. So I just want to ask your opinion, what your thoughts are on that.
Yes, thank you so much, Commissioner, for that question. I think that as Chair Cantu said earlier, this language access is not a new issue. It's an issue that we've been dealing with for years and years. But I will say directly from our experiences and working with folks who had been displaced, who were receiving TSA, that were in Florida and Georgia and beyond, they had great difficulties when they would call to try to update their applications, to try to submit documents. You can imagine that these people did not have access to computers. So they were trying to do, those that did have smartphones would try to access the programming via their smartphones. And it was not user friendly. A lot of times, the way that the information was represented on their phone was not the way that it was being stored or captured via the programming through the FEMA program. In addition, when folks would call that were Spanish language dominant only, they were met oftentimes with folks who could not speak Spanish, who were not bilingual. They did not have access to a language line that could provide translation assistance. And so our hope and our suggestion would be that, yes, absolutely, in the face of what is promising to be an active hurricane season, that FEMA does prepare with adequate language assistance with bilingual workers. And I understand that they train folks in advance and then they deploy them as necessary. Hopefully that won't be the case this hurricane season, but as someone who lives in a state that is that frequently faces these disasters, but is much better equipped than Puerto Rico or the other islands that were impacted by Hurricane Maria, that they prepare accordingly and are ready with materials as well as language assistance that is vitally necessary.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, just indulge me for a second. One thing I did note that I wanted to point out that goes into the area of understanding who it is you're about to serve is that I noted in the IG report that some of the food that was being sent was high carbohydrate, high sugar, non-nutritious stuff to an island that has a disproportionate number of folks who suffer from hypertension, obesity, and diabetes. I mean, these are the kinds of things that FEMA needs to get a handle on, because you don't send a bunch of sugary snacks as a way to help people who are living under abject conditions.
I appreciate that comment. I also want to share with folk that the U.S. Department of Justice has the responsibility to coordinate among the federal agencies a uniform and consistent way of enforcing civil rights. It applies to civil rights like Title IX, and it applies to civil rights like the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that has been the case, again, for a long time. It's not a new set of circumstances that we shouldn't be seeing disparities in how U.S. citizens are being treated under the Civil Rights Act. The other thing I want to share with folk is the effect on young people that their schools have been turned into emergency shelters. And does that disproportionately affect kids with disabilities and kids with communication and lack of access to computers at home in order to make up the deficits because they can't use their schools, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. And again, it's not a new problem. I have the honor of representing the Secretary of Education at a global conference, and the ministers of education from the Gulf and the Caribbean talked about losing their school facilities for a very long time after each storm. and not having the resources to help the kids make up the lost education opportunities. Have any of you anything to respond to that specific problem of young people and how this impacts them after a disaster?
Yes, if it's okay. The island of Vieques didn't have schools for 11 months afterwards. None of their facilities. They have 9 schools on that island, and they were not equipped to handle this. And they all had damages. The Salvation Army, we put solar and water cisterns on them. They didn't have running water. This is something that's inexcusable. Out of ours, and I'm looking this up to make sure that it's the most accurate, 1 out of 9 children suffered from depression during that time. That's our stats from our case management. That is a high level of concern, not just with having the education be, something that is on the back burner, but the depression ratio and that equation, what that does to a child, thinking that they are not as important as a mainlander, thinking that, well, we're a United States citizen, but how come no one's coming to help us? These are things that were discussed by young children. That is something that is concerning. And just in that ratio context of the school not being opened and them not being properly addressed with their needs, that was something that parents also came to us individually and said, how can I help to nurture my child?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioners, Commissioner Kladney.
One more question, Madam Chair. I was wondering, I'll address this to Ms. Romero-Craft. What do you estimate, or can you estimate, the breakdown between homes that were destroyed as a direct result of the hurricane itself, or those lost due to an inadequate response to the hurricane and damage done to those homes?
That is an excellent question. And I would say I could not give you an estimate on that, but I will say that our work directly with a nonprofit organization, Ayuda Legal Hurricanes María, really highlighted the plight of Puerto Ricans as it relates to home ownership and the different property designations that you can have in Puerto Rico, where, as the other panelists have shared, people could have an ancestral home, something that has been passed down, but if they didn't have the proper documentation to show FEMA, then they were denied funding to get the housing repaired. So I think that is a key area where we would recommend that FEMA do follow up and that work closely with the government of Puerto Rico to define all of those different property designations and then accordingly provide funding to get those houses repaired. I cannot tell you the number of folks who either abandoned homes or who had to flee because they knew that they were not going to get, that they were denied FEMA funding, and the home that they had lived in for generations was not going to get replaced or fixed, and had to then leave to the mainland. And I can tell you specifically about what happened in Florida and Georgia. Florida specifically, the lack of affordable housing in the state is at a crisis level. So when you're having folks from Puerto Rico come who had been designated for Section 8 housing in Puerto Rico on the island, and then come to Florida and be put on waiting lists that were years and years long, you find yourself with a housing crisis that really is untenable. And I think you can trace a lot of that to homelessness, children's being displaced even in schools here in the state of Florida. And so this has sort of a negative cascading effect that needs to be addressed, and I believe still can be addressed by working closely with the government of Puerto Rico and making sure that FEMA addresses the differences in Puerto Rican property law that impact how people may apply for and receive funding to get the housing situation addressed.
So what you're saying is the houses that people abandoned never were fixed? Is that correct?
That's correct. Or if they are fixed, as I mentioned, they have blue tarps, they're fixed inadequately. The huge fear is that there's another natural disaster that happens in Puerto Rico, another hurricane, or certainly another an earthquake that may, unfortunately, we've seen hurricanes and earthquakes in Puerto Rico very recently. And I think, the issue that they have with the electrical grid in Puerto Rico is constant and current. It is happening now. People are experiencing blackouts on a weekly basis even. So there are issues that need to be addressed urgently, but that we aren't talking about.
I have one last question. You said in your initial response that you can't tell me the number of homes that were abandoned or destroyed subsequent to the earthquake for lack of a response. When you say that, do you mean that there's a lot? I mean, if you can't tell me the amount, okay, that's fine. But I'm trying to get a picture of a little, moderate, a lot. Do you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely, and you know, I can certainly follow up with that. We have partners on the ground that I would be happy to provide additional information to the commission so that they can review this. But we had folks that were working directly with impacted families. That was not work that we were doing because it needs to be specific to the island, but we can certainly follow up with that.
If you can find out.
Commissioner, I have Commissioner Kirsanow holding
I know,
his hand very patiently.
I would just like to tell this witness that she should take that information and provide it to the same place she sent her statement. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Kirsanow.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to all the panelists. This has been very informative. Do any of you have specific evidence that the disparities in the provision of services or funding by FEMA was the result of any racial animus or invidious discrimination? Anybody can respond. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Commissioner, I can say that we had received reports from individuals that did feel that the lack of response on an individual basis from certain officials that they were working with were as a result. You know, we filed our litigation as against FEMA because we believe the proof is in the data. We still have some outstanding Freedom of Information Act requests to FEMA. And so, you know, our point is you can also ignore what the president said, or President Trump said, in the face of this natural disaster and the treatment of Puerto Ricans. And the treatment of Puerto Ricans that we are discussing today, that we are talking about, really shows that there was certainly a difference of treatment of Puerto Ricans as opposed to other states that were found in similar circumstances. So we do believe that there was some racial animus as it relates to how Puerto Rico was treated.
What was that evidence that those individuals provided that caused them to feel that there was racial discrimination or animus?
Well, in terms of folks that were calling in, we had some individuals who reported to us that they were told that they needed to speak English in light of not having bilingual folks able to assist them over the phone. You know, in terms of folks who had problems receiving not only TSA, but other types of assistance to fix their homes, we had similar turnaway in terms of folks being told, you know, you don't have the necessary paperwork, and not understanding the cultural linguistic differences that provide, you know, that create obstacles for folks to get the aid that they need. And so you can speak to any Puerto Rican about what they saw, what they viewed in terms of what President Trump said, his action and his behavior. And it starts from that point. And so, you know, we would submit that that is certainly something that is tied to the response that was had in Puerto Rico, as well as the reimbursement program that FEMA did install as it relates to major projects in Puerto Rico, knowing the fact that the US government understands the financial difficulties that Puerto Rico is facing. To have a reimbursement program is laughable, quite honestly, because if you have a Commonwealth territory that does not have funding to initiate these programs to ask for reimbursement, then what are you anticipating in terms of major public infrastructure programs? So I think that those all point to, for our from our perspective, sort of the abject failure of the US government to respond to the needs of Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican.
Thank you.
And we're getting close on time, so just I will put a finger and say I will follow up myself and ask for further information from this panel on this point because I'm very interested in what you all have eyewitnessed and what you all have heard from eyewitnesses with regards to departures from policy or departures from practice, unequal treatment. I want to follow up that. It was a very interesting question, and I do want it to do the rest in writing just to save the rest of us time in today's panel. But I will let you answer. Charley Willison, did you have?
Thank you. This is just a broader point about disparities in disaster responses overall. I just want to emphasize that we do know that there's a lot of scholarship on this point that communities of color and low-income communities and low-income communities of color are much more at risk of adverse health and economic consequences from natural disasters, from other public health emergencies because of centuries of political and socioeconomic oppression that have led to wealth disparities, right? So these communities are already more at risk, creating racial disparities. And then we also do know too that when looking at disaster allocations, that low-income communities and communities of color do also receive less allocation of sufficient aid or of aid in general. And there's a lot of scholarship on this as well that I'm happy to share with the community. And so while in thinking about implicit or explicit bias, even in the absence of that evidence, there is a lot of evidence of direct racial disparities in aid allocation.
Commissioners, we're going to end on time. Does that sound right? Okay, so this brings us to the end of the briefing portion of our meeting. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all our panelists. This has been tremendously informative. And on behalf of the entire commission, I wish to thank all of the panelists for sharing their time and their expertise with us. I also want to personally thank the commission staff for their efforts that made in the last few months to pull this virtual briefing together. I know personally it's a lot harder to do it virtually than it is to do it in person and face-to-face. So thank you. And I want to thank the staff in advance for their efforts to distill this information presented in the briefing and to incorporate it into the report. So I'm really grateful for all this hard work. The record for this briefing will remain open for the next 30 days. If panelists or members of the public would like to submit materials, they can mail to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, Office of General Counsel, 1331 Pennsylvania Avenue, Northwest, Suite 1150. Washington, D.C. 20425. There is an email address that I'd like to say it slowly, and that is FEMA briefing, FEMA briefing @usccr.gov. And those materials need to be sent by email or posted no later than July 26, 2021. So I will repeat the email one more time, female briefing @usccr.gov. Thank you all. Thank you, commissioners. Thank you, staff. I'll do a hook 'em horns because I'm a Texan.
No, that's not what I'm going to.
Aw.
Madam Chair, point of order.
Yes, please.
I just wanted to ask leave of the commission to allow Commissioner Degbele to submit his opening statement probably at some point during the time, but not to give it any timeline given the circumstances right now. I know that he very much wanted to be a part of this as a co-sponsor of this with me, and I wanted to make sure that he had leave to provide a written statement for the record.
With no objection, that is an excellent idea. Any other processes? Going once? Going twice?